masters posing on your dollar.
You know, I hate to say this now, but I honestly believe that most of the right wing in America is detrimental to our constitutional republic. Since leaving Twitter about 2 years ago, my main outlet has been TikTok. It is great for making short-term content that pertains to current events. It also allows a little bit more of a personal back and forth with those willing to participate. Being able to make video replies to each other is very interesting as well. It adds just a little bit more humanization and cuts back on some of these keyboard warriors. However, after years of engaging with the right wing, I honestly believe that they may be the biggest threat to our country. And I'm not talking about their personal ideologies nor their feelings about policy. I'm not a big fan of many of their beliefs about how this country should be ran, but it is not the biggest problem in my opinion. The biggest threat they impose is their inability to understand the concepts that they're even talking about. Part 1. What is a democracy? Now I can hear all those people in the back already screaming about how the United States isn't a democracy but a constitutional republic. So many conservatives bring this point up as if it's the nail in the coffin for all left-leaning understanding of the Constitution. It's a talking point meant to deflect from the actual conversation about our representatives without actually having to engage in any direct criticism of them. The United States does not practice a direct democracy, but as I will explain below, uses a form of democracy. We combine the will of certain people within a geographic area to give the total power to one individual through elections. The process is democratic because it is done through free and fair elections. While some may have valid criticism about whether our elections are free and fair, something I will also address later, I'd like to begin with the word democracy. Let's begin with a precise definition of democracy, taken from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The term democracy, as we will use it in this entry, refers very generally to a method of collective decision-making characterized by a kind of equality among the participants at an essential stage of the decision-making process. 4 aspects of this definition should be noted. First, democracy concerns collective decision-making, by which we mean decisions that are made for groups and are meant to be binding on all members of the group. Second, we intend for this definition to cover many different kinds of groups and decision-making procedures that may be called democratic. So there can be democracy in families, voluntary organizations, economic firms, as well as states and transnational and global organizations. The definition is also consistent with different electoral systems, for example, first past the post voting and proportional representation. Third, the definition is not intended to carry any normative weight. It is compatible with this definition of democracy that is not desirable to have democracy in some particular context. So the definition of democracy does not settle any normative questions. Fourth, the equality required by the definition of democracy may be more or less deep. It may be mere formal equality of one person, one vote in an election for representatives to a parliament where there is competition among candidates for the position. Or it may be more robust, including substantive equality in the processes of deliberation and coalition building leading up to the vote. Democracy may refer to any of these political arrangements. It may involve direct referenda of the members of a society in deciding on the laws and policies of the society, or it may involve the participation of those members in selecting the representatives to make the decisions. So, if all members of a group have equal power to cast a vote in some kind of overall decision, then that is basically democracy. Based upon the definition that I just read, a lot of the laws the right wing wants to pass that limit who votes and restricts access to voting would be considered undemocratic. While I agree with this sentiment, it doesn't really apply to the argument I want to make against the right in America. So I will not get into that. I just wanted to mention this here so that you understand that I am aware of the instances that would lead to others to perceive that America is undemocratic in many aspects. When it comes to the concept of democracy, I'd like to work with the actual theory behind it and not just its colloquial use. I believe it's paramount to understand the long and arduous thought journey that our forefathers traveled. Without past wisdom and knowledge, democracy wouldn't mean what it means today. One should read the philosophical works of those that helped craft the framework to really understand what I'm trying to say. You just can't take the term democracy from that time and apply it to today's world. Language isn't static, and political terms evolve much faster and in more complex ways than a lot of other ideas. It's important to know where we came from so that our future paths lead us to new and better roads. Part 2. How the United States is a democracy and a republic at the same time. Now, a republic is a little bit harder to define than a democracy. When one searches the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for the term republic, a page doesn't pop up like it does for democracy. The first hit is about Plato's work called The Republic, which doesn't really answer the question, what is a republic per se, and even recommends authoritarian and totalitarian styles of government. When you Google search republic, it seems the general idea is that it is a government in which supreme power resides in a body of citizens entitled to vote and is exercised by elected officers and representatives responsible to them and governing according to law. Another key element is that there is a chief of state, but in opposition to a monarch. The United States practices a form of a republic called a presidential system, or a single executive system. This form of government usually has a separation of powers from the legislative branch, meaning that citizens either directly or indirectly elect the president, and that president is not beholden to the lawmakers. Usually when one takes issue with the United States being called a democracy, they bring up the Federalist Papers. It seems in the Federalist Papers 9 and 10, Madison only argues against the concept of a direct democracy, which is not at all the same as a democracy, since a direct democracy is a subset of the parent word democracy. A republic, Madison writes, is different from a democracy because its government is placed in the hands of delegates. Madison believes that a republic generally means a form of government that uses representation versus direct governing by the people. He wanted representatives because he believed it would stop factions from being effective and subverting the will of the people. A faction being defined as a number of citizens, whether amounting to a minority or a majority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. I wonder what he would say about populism in today's world, especially the MAGA wing of the right. Let me be also clear that the Federalist Papers are not the ultimate source of authority on what all the founding fathers believed. It was written by 3, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, of the 15 original framers of the Constitution. That is hardly a majority. Beyond that, to believe that one could know and understand the viewpoints of each one would be an insanely difficult task, as neither of them agreed nor disagreed with an issue for the same reason as another. More importantly, while we should build upon and use their original ideas, trying to find ways to fit their views in today's modern political discussion is not only lazy, but incredibly worrisome. So much has changed since they've walked the earth, and their experience is extremely limited. How is it these 15 individuals that lived hundreds of years ago came up with the best political theory that humans have to offer? I find that assumption hard to believe and more frustrating than anything. It seems many Americans' extent of political philosophy begins and ends with what they learn in grade school. They don't continue reading about new political theories as they get older. They just latch on to this founding fathers fallacy because that's all they know and or care to understand about political theory. And what little they think they know, they don't understand at all. Most of the political theory written about what a republic was at the time of the founding fathers was in direct opposition to a direct democracy. More importantly, majority rule. Many feared what would happen to minorities if the mob ruled. However, the idea of minorities wasn't the same concept we use today. Minorities were rich, white, land-owning men men at that time. They feared the political voice of the underclasses since they had more power through the sheer number of votes that they could cast. They built safeguards to protect them from the masses. In some cases, this makes sense. A majority Christian people shouldn't force non-Christian people to follow their rules and principles, or a majority white nation shouldn't treat people of a different skin color differently because they are in the minority. But the problem comes when the minority is doing the harm. Its interests are protected even if it hurts the majority. An example of this is the wealthy and tax breaks. The top 1% of wealth-owning individuals lobby and promote policies that directly hurt the rest of the citizens, but benefit them the most. When they don't pay their fair share of taxes, that burden is then shifted down to the middle and lower classes, thus destroying their ability to create wealth and effectively climb out of their social and political situations. Part 3. The United States Constitution is a hodgepodge of political philosophy. The United States government operates on an incredibly complex system. It takes many different theories of government and smashes them all into one. Overall, the Constitution sets up federalism, which is a theory of government that combines a general government with regional governments, state, territorial, or other subunit governments into a single political system, dividing the powers between the two. The states have the right to govern themselves if they do not violate federal law. This allows states to practice different policies that reflect the majority's will of that region and/or voting area. Each state can then be a breeding ground for possible federal policies without having to subject all states to untested theories. One problem here is that every state is so different in terms of what natural resources they have, climate and weather, the number of people there, access to trade routes, and products they import and export. What policy works in one state may not work in another based upon these vast differences. This is why it's hard for many federal policies to be enacted across all states and vice versa. The minimum wage is a pretty good example. The cost of living and available capital in small rural areas is vastly different from larger urban areas. It may be feasible to raise the minimum wage in some areas, but not so much in other areas with less economic conditions. Rural and urban areas are plagued by different problems, and many policies are not a one-size-fits-all. However, the ability for states and local municipalities to control wages allow local conditions to be taken into consideration. The biggest drawback of this system is that local control can lead to many policies only benefiting those in power or those who bring in capital and control the purse strings of elected and appointed officials. So even though a local municipality could raise the minimum wage, it doesn't. This allows businesses to take advantage of the workforce and continue to pay low wages even if the local economy is prospering. The federal government settles disputes between the states and acts as the ultimate arbiter. Things such as equal rights and equal marriage rights were born through the powers of the federal government, albeit through a judicial branch decision, but a decision that is upheld with the full power of the federal government. The federal government can enforce certain standards that apply equally to everyone. These are the policies that it excels at. The states themselves represent a sort of individualism, while the federal government represents a sort of collectivism. The two different ideologies clash and produce a myriad of policies that continue to be refined or scratched from the books completely. The federal government of the United States has three branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Each of these branches represents a particular idea of political philosophy. The executive branch resembles a monarchy, where one person is the final arbiter. Beyond one being born into their role and the other being voted in, they serve almost the same purpose: to be the figurehead and the general will of the people. While a king may have the final say on all matters, they may take advice from their personal councils. This would be a form of checks and balances, though not as concrete as the one set up in our Constitution. Next is the legislative branch, or rulemaking body. It is split up between the House of Representatives and the Senate. Both are based upon forms of previous governments. The Senate resembles the lords beneath the king, land-owning wealthy people, or possibly oligarchs. There are only 2 senators for each state, making the Senate incredibly small. Senators are more prestigious than their House counterparts, and their seats are harder to obtain. Thus, more resources are needed to obtain and hold a Senate seat. The House of Representatives Representatives represents a closer form of government of the people by the people. Smaller districts are based upon the population size of the state. However, the House doesn't represent all the people, only those who can vote and those that do vote. So even here, the House is not representative of the people per se. Finally, we have the judicial branch. The branch meant to bring justice and uphold the values of law and order. It has the Supreme Court of the United States, which is the final arbiter on all matters. This branch decides the constitutionality of federal laws and resolves any disputes about them. One of the major problems here is that federal laws are not that black and white. Depending on the judge looking at the law, their personal beliefs shape how they interpret the wording and the intent of the laws. While we may love to think that our judges are impartial and only care about the law as it is written, that is an impossible feat. The differences between how a conservative and liberal judge interpret a law passed is vast. Both will say they use the Constitution to guide their decisions, but each have a different understanding of the concepts in the Constitution. And as I've mentioned before about the Constitution not being a final product and the fallacy of the Founding Fathers, the Constitution was written with intentionally vague language, and the framers even left out certain things for the next generation to figure out. It was never meant to be this static document. But even on this fact, there is a disagreement, and I believe that is where a lot of our problems stem from today. It feels like half the country thinks the original framers were some godlike people whom words should live on forever without change, that they understood some kind of empirical truth that no one else could, while the other half of the country understands that the Constitution isn't a finished product, but the beginning of a long evolution of thought. This is why the Supreme Court of the United States has become this new battleground. Stack the court with one political ideology to skirt having Congress act or reverse an act later, and or to prevent the difficult process of amending the Constitution. One issue that can highlight the political ideologies of the different branches is abortion. Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022 under the Dobbs v. Jackson Health Organization court case. This happened mainly because one president was able to pick 3 Supreme Court justices in one term. Former President Trump flooded the bench with anti-abortion justices. This is how the judicial and executive branch were able to bypass the legislative branch and honestly the people. One could say that the people chose Trump, and he was just enacting their will. But that's not really the case. Trump lost the popular vote and only won because of the Electoral College, another system meant to prevent populism and a direct democracy. Beyond that, those who get to participate in elections are also gate-kept. I'll explain this in a later video, but I just wanted to acknowledge the complexity surrounding elections in this country. The issue was then sent to the states due to SCOTUS saying that this was a states' rights issue. Since then, 7 states have passed state constitutional amendments protecting access to abortion: California, Kentucky, Kansas, Michigan, Montana, Ohio, and Vermont. Some of these states are deeply red. How is it possible that abortion, being an issue that Republicans wish to ban or heavily restrict, passed in these states? Well, it's because you can't gerrymander direct democracy. In these elections, everyone had the same amount of power as the person voting next to them. No district was used to dilute their voice based upon a political issue or party. It was one person, one vote across the entire state. It just so happens that when you can't find ways to disenfranchise the power of people's votes, it doesn't line up with whatever party is in power. Why people vote and when they vote, primaries, off election years, presidential, and whatever, are variables that are impossible to quantify and track. Part 4. Who participates makes the rules. Both chambers of Congress and our presidential elections are plagued by the same problems that even the best structured polls have. They're limited by who participates and who is allowed to participate. For example, let's say there is a poll that is trying to gauge how an entire city feels about whether Confederate statues should remain in the public square. This poll is only conducted through email and telephone calls. They get 3,000 responses from a city with a total population of 60,000 people. Of those responses, more than half voted to keep the Confederate statue in place. Can anyone point out the problems with the way the city conducted the poll? One of the biggest is the sample size of the poll. 3,000 out of 60,000 is 5%. However, the total population includes those who can't vote in elections because they're either too young, felons, or whatever. So let's just say 20% of the population is ineligible to vote. That leaves 48,000 voting members. 3,000 of 48,000 is still roughly 6%. Do you think 6% of the total voting population is representative of the people's will? No, not even close. Well, why didn't the other 48,000 people vote? Let's just say the poll was only conducted through home telephone numbers. How many people have home telephones today? Very few. More importantly, what demographic usually has a home phone? The older generation. Of that 3,000, let's say 1,700 votes were collected that way. The other 1,300 were collected on site. Why so little on-site polling? There are so many reasons that cause people not to cast their vote. It's impossible to really know an exact answer. It could have been on a workday, and by the time people got off work, they didn't have time to go vote because they had other responsibilities. There was no early voting offered. The vote was held on a Thursday, which is when the widely popular TV series Game of Thrones aired, so people wanted to get home to watch the show. Since there was only one voting location, many people didn't want to drive over 10 to 15 minutes to get to the location and just decided to skip. Some showed up and saw a long line and said, screw this, it's not that important to me. Many just didn't even bother because the issue didn't affect them either way. Some didn't even know that the voting was taking place. The voting location was held in a church that had Confederate imagery on the outside, which led some not to want to vote because they felt uncomfortable. You see, the 1,300 that showed up to vote probably felt strongly about this issue and would vote no matter how many barriers they had to cross. They would wait through a hurricane for their voice to be heard. But think about this. Why is it that this type of dedication is needed to express one of our most basic fundamental rights? Why are there so many barriers to voting that deters citizens from participating? Why is voting not as easy as owning a gun at this point? Both are rights in the Constitution, but one is so heavily regulated that many just simply choose not to participate. It's asinine when you think about it. So is it fair to say that the city got an accurate feeling of its citizens' will? Is it fair to say that the will of the people would be to keep the statue? In my opinion, no. The many that didn't end up voting chose not to. Maybe not because they didn't care, but the barriers were just too much to deal with. This is why I say we operate somewhat under the idea of one person, one vote. This is why so many abstain or just don't care to vote anymore. It's not worth the labor to do so, and the outcome doesn't even matter to them. Is it fair to say we as Americans operate some form of democracy? Yeah. It is. While we may not be a direct democracy, and things like the above mentioned scenario, money in politics, gerrymandering, and social stigmas that put pressure on whether an individual uses their voice or not, by and large, we elect our representatives through democratic means. I want to point out that most people who call the United States a democracy use it in this colloquial sense. When you Google democracies in the world, every single list has the United States labeled as one, and more concerning, a flawed democracy. Part 5. America, the flawed democracy. What is a flawed democracy? According to the European Center for Populism Studies, a flawed democracy is nations where elections are fair and free and basic civil liberties are honored, but may have issues like media freedom infringement and minor suppression of political opposition and critics. These nations have significant faults in other democratic aspects, including underdeveloped political culture, low levels of participation in politics, and issues in the functioning of governance. One study that indexes this sort of information is the Economist Democracy Index. It produces a weighted average based on the answers to 60 questions, each one with either 2 or 3 permitted answers. Most answers are experts' assessments. Some answers are provided by public opinion surveys from the respective countries. In the cases of countries for which survey results are missing, survey results for similar countries and expert assessments are used to fill in the gaps. The questions are grouped into 5 categories. democracies: electoral process and pluralism, civil liberties, functioning of government, political participation, and political culture. There are 4 types of democracies outlined in the report. Full democracies are nations where civil liberties and fundamental political freedoms are not only respected, but also reinforced by a political culture conducive to the thriving of democratic principles. These nations have a valid system of governmental checks and balances, an independent judiciary whose decisions are enforced, governments that function adequately, and diverse and independent media. These nations have only one limited problems in democratic functioning. Flawed democracies are nations where elections are fair and free, and basic civil liberties are honored but may have issues, like media freedom, infringement, and minor suppression of political opposition and critics. These nations can have significant faults in other democratic aspects, including underdeveloped political culture, low levels of participation in politics, and issues in the functioning of governance. Hybrid regimes are nations with regular electoral frauds, preventing them from being fair and free democracies. These nations commonly have governments that apply pressure on political opposition, non-independent judiciaries, widespread corruption, harassment, and pressure placed on the media, anemic rule of law, and more pronounced faults than flawed democracies in the realms of underdeveloped political culture, low levels of participation in politics, and issues in the functioning of governance. Authoritarian regimes are nations where political pluralism is non-existent or severely limited. These nations are often absolute monarchies or dictatorships, may have some conventional institutions of democracy, but with little significance. Infringements and abuses of civil liberties are commonplace. Elections, if they take place, are not free or fair, including sham elections. The media is often state-owned or controlled by groups associated with the ruling regime. The judiciary is not independent, and censorship and suppression of governmental criticism are commonplace, which is interesting because that's what every right-winger thinks any Democratic president does. I don't even know how like Biden or Obama fits in any of this shit at all. North America as a continent is ranked as a functioning democracy. That is only because Canada has such a higher score that it brings up America's flawed democracy score. But when we look at it separately, Canada is considered a full democracy, slightly dropping in points in 2021. America dropped into the flawed democracy the year Donald Trump was elected in 2016. Who'da fucking thought? And has since been slowly dropping. Canada is ranked 19th in the world, while America is ranked 30th. Taiwan, Japan, Costa Rica, Chile, and South Korea all rank higher than the United States. One of the biggest reasons why America dropped with the election of Donald Trump has to do with the rise of populism. Populism hurts democratic institutions. Authors Cas Mood, a Dutch political scientist, and Cristobal Altwasser, a Chilean political scientist, discuss the role of populism in deteriorating liberal democracies. Within the article, Mood and Kaltwasser say that populism, although surrounded by negative connotations, is democratic in nature, as it gives a voice to the people and heavily follows the idea of majoritarian rule. The problem arises within liberal democracies, as the authors say that liberal values and democracy internally contradict each other. Democracy promises majoritarian rule, while the liberal values promise the protection of minorities. Furthermore, it is said that populism is a product of democracy, but in general, populist leaders try to use the democratic aspect of liberal democracies to undermine liberalism. The authors try to establish the idea that the rise of populism is undermining liberal values, as populism, at its core, rejects plurality and minority protection, often evident liberal values. Trump's rise to power was based upon the promotion of illiberal values, a notable example being the exclusion of immigrants and openly xenophobic statements. This wave has been labeled as xenophobic populism. Trump gave a voice to xenophobia, anti-Muslim prejudice, and aggrieved nationalism. These things are synonymous with right-wing populism, as defined as a political ideology that combines right-wing politics and populist rhetoric and themes. themes. Its rhetoric employs anti-elitist sentiments, opposition to the establishment, and speaking to or for the common people. Recurring themes of right-wing populists include neo-nationalism, social conservatism, economic nationalism, and fiscal conservatism. Frequently, they aim to defend a national culture, identity, and economy against perceived attacks by outsiders. This type of ideology is still dominant in the Republican Party today. I'll be making part 2 very soon, but my ADHD just creeps up on me a lot and it's becoming harder and harder to finish my long form videos. I'm sorry. I've been writing and editing this one for like the last 6 months and it's just very taxing. But I do believe this conversation is incredibly important and I will work on creating a follow-up conversation about the glaring problem of a free society and a democratic government. Here, I will not only address misinformation and the spread of news, but also how the voting bloc of the United States is crafted through policy and gerrymandering. Thanks everyone for the continued support, and please follow me on TikTok. Since Twitter has become a shithole, that is where I spend most of my time. Be safe, and until next video, have a good one.